Giovanni here with our next biology lesson, this time on photosynthesis. So the first question that comes up is what types of things do photosynthesis? And there's a variety of bacteria, and this is certainly not all bacteria, but there are some bacteria that can do photosynthesis. Now, bacteria are prokaryotic organisms, and they lack organelles. They lack those complex structures like a chloroplast or a mitochondria, for example. So they don't do photosynthesis in the same way. They do it in a little bit of a different way than plants and algae, which takes these to the next one, which would be algae. Now, algae are not plants. They are protists. They are plant-like protists, and they are single-celled organisms. Now, the way in which they do photosynthesis is very similar to that of plants because they do have chloroplasts, because protists are eukaryotic organisms. And then, of course, plants do photosynthesis, specifically in the leaves where they contain their chloroplasts right within their cells. So looking a little bit more closely at a chloroplast, we have an image of one here. Now, chloroplasts are unique. They're one of two types of organelles that have double membranes. So if you take a look at the structure on the outside of this chloroplast here, you should see two coverings on the outside of it. It has evidence of how the chloroplast got into the plant cells to begin with. There's a theory called the endosymbiotic theory that chloroplasts used to be their own self-living organisms, and then they were engulfed or eaten by a plant-like cell, and then the chloroplast just went on living inside of it, which is really quite of an interesting scenario because normally when living things eat other living things, they digest them for food. But in this case, the chloroplast lived. Well, ultimately here, the main structure that I want you to take note of is the thylakoids, which are these green stacked discs. These green stacked discs, again called thylakoids, are where all of the photosynthesis happens, or at least most of it. Right in the membrane of them, they have a phospholipid bilayer like we saw earlier with our cell membranes, and that's where we see most of the photosynthesis taking place. Now, within that thylakoid membrane, there will be a molecule of chlorophyll, lots of molecules of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is essentially a pigment, and a pigment is something that can absorb certain frequencies of light and then reflect others. If you take a look down here at this image on the bottom right-hand corner, you have a sun there with all of the different colors of light shining out from it, and all of the varieties or all the wavelengths of light do leave from the sun. And it contains all of the visible spectrum that we can see. So within there, you'll have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, all of those colors, and then everything in between. And so when that light hits a leaf, or when specifically it hits chlorophyll, the green light is reflected and the other colors are absorbed. Because the green light is reflected, we see the leaf and the chlorophyll as green. The other light that gets absorbed is what is the energy that's used to power the process of photosynthesis. So this pigment of chlorophyll's job essentially is to absorb certain wavelengths of light. Ultimately, photosynthesis is just one big chemical reaction. It's a type of chemical reaction where we're going to build something more complex. So it's an anabolic type of reaction. Over here on the left-hand side, we have the reactants. In any chemical reaction, the reactants are written on the left-hand side. And these two reactants are carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide gets into the plant specifically from the atmosphere through its leaves. On plant leaves, in the bottom side of them, they have these tiny pores that are called stomata, and they can open and close to allow for gas exchange. Carbon dioxide enters through there. Water enters through the roots in the ground, and then it's carried through a series of what we call a vascular tissue, up through the roots, through the stems, and then out eventually into the leaves where it can be used. So these two are our reactants. Notice sunlight down here, how it was not written on the reactants side because sunlight is energy. Anything that's energy cannot be written on the reactant side because it does not have mass. Because it doesn't have mass, we can't include it in the chemical reaction, at least as a reactant or product. But we can write it either above or below the arrow like we've done here to signify that it is the energy source that allows this reaction to take place. And of course, sunlight comes down from the sun and then it will land on the leaves and the plants absorb it through the chlorophyll there. The things that are made are the products. The two products here are first glucose, and this ultimately is the end goal of photosynthesis. This is why plants are doing photosynthesis, is to make glucose. It is what we call stored chemical energy, and it will be used by the cells to do many other things, most importantly to do cellular respiration and make ATP. The other product is oxygen, which is really a waste product. Plants and algae never really intended to make oxygen. It's kind of just an accident that they do. Certainly we are very glad that they do because we will use oxygen in our cellular respiration, but it was never intended to be made. And it will exit the plant through the leaves, through those same stomata that the carbon dioxide came in through. Here's an overlook of the whole process of photosynthesis, and you can see at the top and bottom of this chloroplast here, you can see the reactants at the top and then the products down at the bottom. You'll notice that there's quite a bit of other things going on inside it. And specifically, if I drew a line right down the middle of this, I could separate this chloroplast into two halves, or the two reactions that we see in photosynthesis. The first reaction is we call the light-dependent reactions. In the light-dependent reactions, this is where light is actually used. Just an overview of this process is water will be brought in, and using energy from light, the water is split. When water is split, you release some oxygen, and we're going to use the energy there to make a couple other chemical compounds that then go over to what we call the Kelvin cycle, or the light-independent reaction. This is called it because simply it just does not use light directly. Now it does rely upon the light-dependent reaction for the things that were made in it, but it does not absorb light in order for this process to happen. A quick overview of the Kelvin cycle is carbon dioxide is brought in, and eventually we make glucose. You can see there's two separate processes here taking place inside of the photosynthesis, or inside of the chloroplast to do photosynthesis. Let's take a look at each one of them individually. Let's start with the light-dependent reaction. In the light-dependent reaction, what's going to happen first is water is going to be brought into each of the plant cells in the leaves. It's brought in through the roots and then carried through that vascular system, as I mentioned before, so that it's available to the cells. Then, using energy from light, that water is going to be split up. Now, water is made of hydrogen and oxygen, but there's also electrons that are within the chemical bonds that was holding the hydrogen and oxygen together. All three of those things are released. So you now have hydrogen by itself, oxygen by itself, and then a few lone electrons. Well, oxygen is so reactive that what it'll end up doing is it just reacts with another oxygen atom nearby, and it forms O2, or oxygen gas. That O2 will then leave out of the cell and then out through the stomata into the atmosphere. Well, we have two other things, which were hydrogen and electrons. Those two things, through a very complex chemical pathway, will be used to make ATP and NADPH. Now, these two things right here are really the end goal of the light-dependent reaction. These are the products. ATP and NADPH are both forms of usable chemical energy that are going to be used in the Kelvin cycle. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at ATP and NADPH. This analogy here refers to them as rechargeable batteries. So the ADP, which is listed right over here, and the NADP plus are really what we would consider to be the not fully charged versions of these two chemical compounds. And then through the light-dependent reaction, they become charged. So we make ATP and we make NADPH. Now, these are fully charged batteries and they're ready to be used. Again, these are just chemical compounds. The way that they're used is that their chemical bonds will be broken. Specifically in NADPH, this hydrogen bond right here will be broken off and the energy released will be harnessed to do other things. In ATP, we break the bond with the last phosphorus atom. So if you break this bond off, you then have ADP, which is here. If you break off this hydrogen atom right here, you have NADP+. And so this ATP and NADPH actually can cycle back and forth between the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction, being used over and over again. So now let's take a look at the light-independent reaction. In this reaction here, we start with bringing in carbon dioxide, again through those stomata, and they make their way into the chloroplast. Once there, now we're going to use that ATP and NADPH that was made in the light-dependent reaction. That energy is essentially going to be used to rearrange the carbon dioxide to make glucose. Glucose is a carbon-containing atom. All of that carbon came from carbon dioxide. So again, the end product here, the end goal of the light-independent reaction, also known as the Kelvin cycle, is ultimately to make glucose. Take note up here as well, now that the ATP and NADPH have been used, they are now ADP and NADP+, and they'll make their way back over to, not shown in this image, the light-dependent reaction to get recharged. So what do living things use glucose for? Well, the first and most important thing is for cellular respiration so that they can make ATP. ATP, as we've mentioned before, is usable chemical energy, and the cells use ATP to do just about everything inside of them. What can also happen to glucose is it can be linked together to form things like starch. Starch is a long-term energy storage found within plants. Now, similarly, animals can link together their extra glucose molecules into glycogen to do the same type of thing. It's a long-term energy storage so that if the organism needs some glucose to do cellular respiration, it can have some on hand and ready to be stored. Another thing is in the creation of cellulose. Now, cellulose is a building material specifically for plant cells and their cell walls. And again, all that cellulose is a bunch of glucose molecules linked together end to end to end to form this structure. So glucose really used for three things. It's an energy source to be burned, an energy storage, and it can also be used for structural, for building materials. So again, here we have an overlook of the whole process of photosynthesis here between the chloroplast and the reaction at the bottom. I just want to highlight again the fact that in the light-dependent reactions right here, ATP and NADPH are charged. Then they're used up over here in the Kelvin cycle, and so now they're essentially like dead batteries here. They make their way back over the light-dependent reaction where they get charged. So they're charged, used, dead, recharged. If we take a look too now, we can break apart the light-dependent versus the light-independent reaction. So these yellow circles right here are showing you all of the things that are used in the light-dependent reaction. Water being brought in, light, of course, being used to create oxygen gas. The things that are used in the Kelvin cycle or the light-independent reaction are carbon dioxide being brought in for the reactant, and then the production of glucose. Looking at the whole overall product here, we can see that half the reactants are used in the light-dependent reaction, and half of them are used in the light-independent reaction. And then similarly, half of the products are created in the light-dependent reaction, and half of the products are created in the light-independent reaction. So that's our look at photosynthesis. From here, we'll move on next into cellular respiration.